Thank you all for coming, and welcome to the Professor Chinmoy Banerjee Memorial Lecture in Anti-Racism. This annual commemorative lecture is co-hosted by the Institute for the Humanities here at Simon Fraser University, the Dr. Hari Sharma Foundation, the West Coast Coalition Against Racism, and the South Asian Network for Secularism and Democracy. My name is M.V. Ramana, and I teach at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia here in Vancouver. I'm also a member of the board of the Hari Sharma Foundation and a member of the South Asia Network for Secularism and Democracy. I would like to begin by respectfully acknowledging that we are meeting on the unceded traditional territories, including the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam nations, where this room is located. And I, for one, sort of feel grateful to be able to be here. And I invite you to think about what this being here means to each of you. Before I introduce the speaker, I would like to say a few words about the person in whose memory this lecture is organized, Professor Chinmoy Banerjee, known to many of us as Chin or Chinda. Chinda taught English literature, literary criticism, and post-colonial studies here in Simon Fraser University for 35 years. He came here after obtaining his PhD in 18th century English literature from Kent State University. But of course, we wouldn't be titling this lecture as a lecture in anti-racism if Chinda was just specializing in 18th century English literature. We do so because Chinda had a lifelong involvement in progressive politics. But this started during his time at Kent State University, which was at that time marked by protests against the Vietnam War. On May 4th, 1970, Chinda, when trying to bring his 4-year-old son, Anand, to campus preschool, was turned away by nervous National Guardsmen who pointed rifles at his car. A few hours later, 4 students had been shot dead. Some of you might remember a famous photo of a young woman screaming and gesturing at a young man's dead body. It was that event that Chinda might have been witness to had he actually gone through in that car. The shootings influenced further anti-Vietnam War protests across college campuses in the United States, as well as at the White House, where over 100,000 people protested just a few days later on May 9th, 1970. But that event really changed Chinda's perspectives as well and led to his political allegiances becoming crystallized. Later that year, the family moved to Canada, and Chinda began to teach English here at Simon Fraser University. In 1975, he took a 1-year leave from SFU and moved with his family to India with the hope that he would make the move permanent. Unfortunately, at the same time, the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi declared a state of emergency, and thousands of people critical of her government were imprisoned and tortured without trial. That eventually led to Chinda and his family returning back to Canada, but then his political activism took a turn towards solidarity with political activism in India. And this is when he co-founded an advocacy collective called the Indian People's Association in North America, IPANA, in 1975. IPANA was an organization of progressive Indians living in North America who opposed imperialism and supported democratic rights and social justice in India. IPANA established chapters in many North American cities, including Vancouver, of course, Montreal, Toronto, and New York. It was then led by Dr. Hari Sharma of the Hari Sharma Foundation, Dr. Daya Verma in Montreal, and Dr. Vinod Mubai in New York. Chinda became one of the leaders of IPANA and wrote for its 2 publications, New India Bulletin and India Now. Having engaged in various anti-racist struggles in the 1970s, Chinda was also one of the founding members and leaders of the British Columbia Organization to Fight Racism, which became a prominent anti-racist organization in this province. Among its significant achievements was to significantly mobilize various groups from very different sectors to stand together and oppose the Ku Klux Klan, which was then attempting to establish a new base of operations in Vancouver in the early 1980s. Chinda was also a strong supporter of the Canadian Farm Workers Union, which took up the cause of mostly immigrant farm workers. I mean, farm workers in general, but most of them were immigrants, and who had until then been excluded from protection under British Columbia's labor laws. And it was a very successful, eventually successful opposition movement. He was also one of the founding members and leaders of the Non-Resident Indians for Secularism and Democracy, which eventually became the South Asian Network for Secularism and Democracy. Throughout his life, Chinda remained devoted to the ideals of democracy in India. He was outraged by the attacks on democratic freedoms by the current government of Narendra Modi. Under Modi's government, he saw India moving in an anti-democratic direction, with persecutions against minorities reaching levels reminiscent of Europe before World War II. Whenever protests arose in India against government authoritarianism and attacks on minorities, he always supported them. He spearheaded local protests in British Columbia against the lynching of Muslims, the attack on the professors and students at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, and attacks on Dalits. Chinda passed away in 2002, leaving behind a legacy of activism in the service of humankind. I should also mention that Chinda was the first president of the Hari Sharma Foundation that is financially sponsoring today's lecture. The foundation also sponsors a range of other events and funds multiple research projects, other projects having to do with activism and scholarships. I now turn to today's speaker, who, like Chinda, represents a long history of progressive activism, Pragna Patel. Pragna is currently the co-founder and co-director of Project Resist, an organization focused on work with marginalized and vulnerable women and girls throughout the UK. But her longer history of activism has primarily been with the well-known Southall Black Sisters, which was founded in 1979 as an activist group by Asian, African, and Caribbean women who wanted to address both sexism and racism, and emerged into an advocacy and campaigning center for Black and minority peoples. The center has played a leading role in challenging and shaping government policy on the issues facing Black and minoritized women in the UK, and offered an intensive and extensive service to women facing violence. And Pragna is the former director and a founding member of the center, where she worked from 1982 to January 2022, with just a break in 1993 when she left to train and practice as a solicitor. Over those 40 years, she led on some of the Southall Black Sisters' most important cases and campaigns on gender-based abuse, including a landmark case involving Kiranjit Ahluwalia, a South Asian woman who was convicted of the murder of her violent husband. The case eventually led to a reform of the homicide law in the UK and created greater societal awareness of domestic abuse and the lack of effective state responses. She was also a founding member of Women Against Fundamentalism and has written extensively on race, gender, and religion. I think few people could be better suited than Pragna to be giving a lecture named after Chinmoy Banerjee. In their tribute to Pragna when she left the organization, the Southall Black Sisters started with a quote, "Activism is the rent we pay to live on this planet." This is a very appropriate slogan for all of us to adopt. The title of Pragna's talk today is "The Challenge Before Us, Moving from a Politics of Identity to a Politics of Solidarity." And that, of course, is indeed a big challenge. She'll be drawing on her 40 years of feminist and anti-racist activism, including the fact that her organization always had to deal with the accusation that she and other South Asian women are not Black. Pragna instead asserted the importance of unity in the face of shared struggles against racism and histories of colonization, thus implicitly and explicitly challenging the cul-de-sac of racial and religious identity politics. I now turn the floor over to Pragna.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You've done a lot of homework about me. I'm really honored to be here to make this presentation in memory of the work and political activism of Dr. Chinmoy Banerjee. And it's really an honor to be here in the shadow of someone who's done so much in the field of anti-racism and social justice. When I was approached earlier this year to make this presentation, my ears were still ringing with the words uttered by the UK Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, at a press conference in 2025, May 2025, introducing what he described as his strategy to take back control of the borders, of our borders. It was plain that he felt that he had to respond to increasingly louder demands that migrants had to be stopped from coming into the UK. And then this dog whistle. Without rules to stop immigration, he said, we risk becoming an island of strangers. These words actually affected me in more ways than one, both politically and personally. They were an explicit echo of the words of the influential right-wing Tory politician Enoch Powell in his now infamous Rivers of Blood speech in 1968, some 6 decades ago. Speaking about immigrants from the new Commonwealth in the UK, Powell had declared that white citizens found themselves made strangers in their own land. Showing off his learning as a reputed classics scholar, he added, as I look ahead, I am filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with so much blood. Of course, Keir Starmer has since claimed that he was unaware of any echo of Powell's words, but he would have us believe that he was simply parroting the words written for him by his junior speechwriter, and that it was pure coincidence that they both talked about islands of strangers. In any event, the reality is that Starmer's words and the policies of his government come in the context of a palpable ascendancy of the far right over the last few years in the UK, as well as in Europe, and indeed throughout the world. This resurgence of far-right nationalism, fascism, and authoritarianism, partly driven by a deep sense of alienation from and widespread lack of trust in political institutions, represents the most serious political crisis that I can remember, and it is a profoundly dangerous moment. In the UK, this crisis saw itself reflected in widespread far-right violence in August 2024, following the horrific killings of 3 young girls, Elsie Stancombe, Alice Da Silva Agua, and BB King, in a small northern town of Southport by a black youth aged 18 years. Although he was a British citizen, having arrived in the UK with his parents from Rwanda when he was still a very young boy, he became the subject of baseless allegations fanned by right-wing media and politicians that he was an asylum seeker who had come to the UK in a small boat, which is a current shorthand for the many unwanted migrants who make the perilous journey, literally taking their life in their hands, in small dinghies across the English Channel. His senseless violence against the girls became the focal point of race riots across the country. With the aid of a right-wing press and widespread disinformation on social media, prominent politicians such as Nigel Farage utilized the tragedy and other grievances to mainstream an extreme nationalist, racist, and misogynist agenda in the wider political discourse with the aim of destroying the plural and democratic fabric of society. And it is this right-wing populism that has emboldened far-right groups to play on the fears of the white working classes, vast swathes of which feel economically left behind with some justification. Driven by a siege mentality and convinced of their marginalization in their own country, their answer is to engage in what they believe to be justified political violence against what they perceive as the cause of their ills, migrants and anyone else who doesn't look like them. We are, in effect, witnessing the rise of right-wing identity politics that comes on the back of years of neoliberal policies involving austerity, privatization, and in the UK context, the Brexit disaster, all of which has deepened inequality and division. 1 year on from the August 2024 far-right riots, we have seen a palpable increase in support for such dangerous and threatening politics. So throughout the summer, we had the St. George's Cross and the Union Jack put up outside the homes and on the streets across the country to proclaim a nationalist identity, English or British, that was meant to exclude anyone who was not considered to belong or acceptable. And it is in this febrile atmosphere of hatred, violence, and fear that Sharma and his Labour government appears to have capitulated to an ever-increasing authoritarian agenda set largely by the far right, and which is centered on clamping down on migration, equality initiatives, and any form of dissent. At the same time, there remains an abject failure to acknowledge the colonial legacy, the background to the migration in the UK. And this was the context of Sharma's Island of Strangers speech earlier this year, echoing Powell's Rivers of Blood speech in 1968. However, the difference between then and now is that Powell was actually dismissed from the shadow cabinet for making what was widely perceived to be unacceptable racist remarks, such far-right rhetoric and racism, however, is now no longer confined to the fringes, but emanates from the very heart of government and has become normalized. The racism we are witnessing today in the UK is also contemporary in its form because it has the potential to radicalize a diverse range of actors, including white women and even members of ethnic minorities, particularly British Hindus and Sikhs, who have been drawn towards the ideology by their anti-Muslim and anti-asylum seeker rhetoric. The question then is, how do we challenge this development when the left itself has become fragmented, divisive, and dogmatic, fractured by a politics that focuses on identity above anything else? We're at a political juncture where regressive identity politics have, I believe, taken hold at both ends of this political spectrum, radiating forms of authoritarianism from above, that is from the state, but also from below, that is within our own movements. My entry into the politics of identity began with my engagement in the anti-racist and feminist politics of the late 70s and early 80s in South or West London, and Romana talked a bit about that just now. I began my political life working with other progressives and anti-racist activists from diverse minority backgrounds who sought to challenge racism by mobilizing around the term Black. Back then, the term was used in an inclusive way to bring together all people affected by histories of colonialism and racism. Of course, this didn't mean that Black political identity was uncontested, but within anti-racist circles, it was generally accepted as a secular and non-sectarian identity with a focus very much on difference across class, caste, religion, and ethnicity. Sorry, the focus on unity across differences of class, caste, religion, and ethnicity. It has a very different meaning. Our aim was to use the term in an inclusive way to bring together all people. And it was a politics that borrowed heavily from the American civil rights movement and global anti-colonial struggles. It was also a form of political resistance that built on earlier workplace struggles by first-generation migrants, particularly from the new Commonwealth and in particular the Indian subcontinent. So, for example, the mid-70s had seen many strikes across the UK, addressing a range of problems, including discrimination in the workplace, poor working conditions, low wages, and management divide and rule tactics. Those strikes signaled a wave of activism led particularly by South Asian women, such as those who took part in the iconic Imperial strike, typewriters strike in Leicester in 1974, and the Gromwick strike in West London in 1976. In the process, these women shattered myths about Asian female passivity and paved the way for a wave of secular women's activism that spread out in multiple directions a few years later. Our campaigns against violence against women in the 1980s, for example, can be traced back to those earlier secular struggles outside the factory gates. What made these forms of resistance all the more remarkable is that they were waged by a generation of Black and minority women and men who were not part of the old labor movement and their institutions. Their struggles emphasized the necessity of solidarity, which saw white workers and from time to time parts of the established trade union movement joining in. For example, dockers, who once marched in support of Enoch Powell, joined miners on the picket lines in solidarity with the Gromwick strikers. These were early attempts to connect race with class, so that the focus was on resistance to exploitation and racism at the workplace, as well as racism on the streets. It is also why the early migrants, especially those from communist, trade union, and socialist background in the South Asian subcontinent and the Caribbean alike, created secular organizations like the Indian Workers Association to help people in their everyday struggles against racism, discrimination, and poverty. This feature of early anti-racist struggles is often forgotten, even though it was critical in forging a secular and progressive anti-racist identity in which issues of ethnicity, religion, and caste had no significance. Another critical aspect of the early mobilizations was that the youth who had grown up in the UK took an interest in the struggles, which expanded to cover not just racial and fascist violence on the streets, but also discriminatory immigration policies and police brutality in places like Southall and Bradford, leading directly to the formation of initiatives such as the Asian Youth Movement, or its manifestations in the form of the United Black Youth League and others up and down the country. The period saw frequent clashes between, on the one hand, the National Front and the British National Party, two dominant, if still small, far-right fringe organizations, and on the other, South Asians from Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh backgrounds, as well as African Caribbeans, who often joined forces in the anti-racist fight back. For example, the iconic defense of Southall on the 22nd of April 1979, in the face of a fascist gathering in the area led by the National Front, depended on connections and a sense of solidarity formed around Black resistance. The moment also brought into sharp focus the state's deliberate use of a militarized police force to brutally clamp down on the anti-racist protests. The result included the police killing of the anti-racist activist Blair Peach and the arrests of hundreds of young Asian men, alongside the destruction of an Afro-Caribbean cultural center and a vicious physical assault on its leader, Clarence Baker. The slogan, "Self-defense is no offense," was first coined in the heat of such anti-racist protests and was later appropriated by Black feminists like myself in the fight against violence against women. However, what is little known is that on that very same day, around 20,000 local workers went on unofficial strike to support the protest against the National Front. It was in the heat of these anti-racist uprisings and a second wave feminist movement that was also underway that feminist groups like Southall Black Sisters emerged into existence. Embracing the term Black as a secular and progressive mobilizing identity, it allowed us to both borrow from the left anti-racist and feminist movements within which we were located, at the same time as to challenge those movements to address the specific socioeconomic experiences of Black women. Our decision to organize autonomously grew out of our frustration with the failure of the anti-racist movement to deal with the women's question in the anti-racist mobilizations, and out of the failure of the wider feminist movement to deal with the question of race. By organizing autonomously, our aim was not to separate ourselves off from other Black or feminist struggles, but to strengthen them by bringing our critical perspectives to those struggles. We argued that the pursuit of equality and freedom involved being simultaneously attentive to a range of intersecting forms of oppression, such as those experienced by Black and minority women, because they led to heightened forms of discrimination, exclusion, and powerlessness. This political stance was by no means unique. We were members of a sister body called the Organization of Women of Asian and African Descent, OWAD, which became a critical space within which to form a common agenda based on the shared political values of socialism, feminism, and anti-racism. I recently came across their 1980 newsletter, which contains a remarkable statement of intent. It formed the blueprint, the political blueprint, for the secular, socialist, Black feminism that we aspired to create. And I think it is worth quoting in full, if not to remind myself just, how far we have come. As Black socialist feminists, it is incumbent upon us to point out that women's oppression is inextricably bound up with the issues of race and class, and that it is right and necessary to tackle all three simultaneously and with equal determination. However, having declared the inextricable links between sex, race, and class, we have the responsibility to carry through the political arguments with regard to feminism. This means that the thrust of our work will have two strands. On the one hand, we continue to organize autonomously and address the issues we face as Black women. On the other, we must bring a feminist perspective to the work of our comrades in mixed, progressive Black organizations. In this way, we will be raising the consciousness of the Black community within the context of the totality of Black socialist politics. And it was this perspective that led us to support a range of struggles by the white working classes and other disenfranchised groups. For example, as Black feminists, we joined delegations in the 1980s to support the Republicans during the Northern Ireland Troubles and the mining communities during the Great Miners' Strike of 1984. These were genuine attempts to build solidarity across difference and to locate ourselves within a left politics, even though as Black feminists, we had to fight for legitimacy from within. By trying to forge such alliances, we were also trying to bridge the gap between anti-racism, feminism, and socialist left politics. And it was this same Black identity that also led us to successfully mobilize across racial, ethnic, and religious lines around the issue of violence against women, the dominant issue that women presented with when they arrived at our door seeking help and protection when I was at Southall Black Sisters. This reality compelled us to critique constructions of monolithic Black communities of resistance, on which the anti-racist movement also rested. We pointed to the ways in which Black communities were homogenized by the left, by state policies on multiculturalism, more of which I will speak about in a minute, and by internal community forces of tradition and patriarchy, which served only to deny other fault lines and axes of power based on class, caste, and sex. In 1984, we organized the first women's protest against violence against women and girls in Southall. It followed the death of a local woman, Krishna Sharma, who was driven to take her own life due to domestic abuse. The protest was a bold but necessary move in a context where male community leaders, including those who saw themselves as anti-racist, kept a tight lid on issues such as domestic abuse, forced marriage, honor-based violence, and domestic abuse-related suicides, deeming them to be private matters to be resolved internally without state interference. We took to the streets of Southall as women to name and shame Krishna Sharma's perpetrators publicly, and to question the legitimacy of religious and cultural values such as honor and shame that condoned violence against women and crushed their hopes, aspirations, and freedoms. We surrounded the home of her husband and in-laws, and we demanded justice in her name. We borrowed these tactics explicitly from the Indian feminist movement, which had campaigned in very public ways to shame perpetrators of dowry-related violence in the 1980s in India. In the face of widespread failure by the Indian state to protect women and to hold perpetrators to account, such protest appeared to be the only effective course of action left to thousands of Indian women who wanted accountability from the perpetrators and from the state. And in some ways, it was a precursor of the Me Too movement. In an effort to make common cause with other Asian women who experienced abuse, we went on to organize a public meeting that joined the campaign for Krishna Sharma with that of Rubina Akram, a Pakistani woman whose husband had taken an axe to her face, leaving her severely disfigured for life. And we joined forces with the campaign around Iqbal Begum, a Mirpuri Pakistani woman who killed her husband following a history of domestic abuse. By inhabiting public spaces collectively, we tried to ensure that long suppressed accounts of domestic and sexual violence and injustice, irrespective of women's backgrounds, were acknowledged and addressed by the community and the state alike. We also sought and won the support of the wider white feminist movement, which was critical to us because we wanted to show that it was possible to confront specific cultural norms that justified patriarchal violence and control within minority communities, while at the same time building a common feminist movement for change for all women. The significance of such a move was twofold. It countered the inevitable instrumentalization of our struggle by racists who tried to use our protests to demonize minorities as a whole. And it also challenged reactionary forces within our communities who decried feminism as a Western concept, rather than a universal response to female oppression and patriarchal power. The high point of this work was the creation of a strong coalition of white and Black feminists in the early 90s to campaign together around the case of Kiranjit Ahluwalia that we mentioned just earlier, a Punjabi Sikh woman who killed her husband after 10 years of an abusive and coercive marriage. She was found guilty of his murder and sentenced to life in prison. But at her trial, the court had failed to consider her experiences of abuse within her specific cultural context. We took on the case after her conviction and supported Kiranjit to mount a successful appeal against her murder conviction. This involved a challenge to the law in relation to the defense of provocation in the context of homicide. And the problem was that the defense, provocation defense, was constructed around the basis of male-on-male violence, which by its very nature did not allow for an examination of the abusive context in which women might be driven to kill, usually out of fear, despair, and trauma. Nor did it take account of the very real cultural, social, economic constraints that prevent women from exiting abuse. Linking the case with that of other white women who had also been jailed for killing their violent partners, we campaigned to highlight the unjust life sentences they received and the institutionalized nature of the discrimination that they faced within the criminal justice system. Mobilizing around political slogans such as self-defense is no offense, borrowed from our anti-racist struggles, we brought together women who were young and old, white and black, activists and professionals, survivors and organizations, in what were some of the largest, noisiest, and most colorful protests that had been seen in a long time. We protested outside the Home Office on a weekly basis during the campaign and at the Court of Appeal in 1994, when Kiranjit's successful appeal against her murder conviction was finally heard. The campaign resulted not only in Kiranjit's release from prison, but also in critical reforms to the law of homicide, none of which could have been achieved without the broad supporting alliance involving women from diverse backgrounds. The case and campaign also led to normative shifts in public perceptions of domestic abuse. Certainly in South Asian and other minority communities, what were once taboo subjects were now out in the open and paved the way for our challenge to the state's policy around multiculturalism, leading to its failure to address other issues such as forced marriage, honor-based violence, and FGM, which were viewed at the time as cultural matters only. Until the early 2000s, multiculturalism was the official framework for managing race relations in the UK. Born out of state policies and community self-definition, the model gave prominence to self-appointed leaders, usually from conservative and religious backgrounds or business classes, who acted as mediators between the state and minorities. These forces lost no time in using their newfound status as power brokers to stifle dissenting voices from within and to undermine secular feminist struggles against violence and for protection, rights, and accountability in the private sphere of the family. For our part, whilst we maintain that multiculturalism has a part to play in challenging racism, we pointed out that it had very negative consequences for minority women. The multicultural model that emerged as official state policy was in fact an anti-democratic development that lent itself to collusion with patriarchal systems of control and to the institutionalization of cultural relativism in law and social policy. The irony, however, is that the hands-off approach advocated by the patriarchs was also viewed by many on the left as anti-racist because it signaled respect for culture and religious identity. This reflected the lapse of currents within the anti-racist left into the promotion of essentialist and reified forms of identity politics that did not concern itself with the question of power and how it is allocated or withheld within our communities. However, by the late 90s and early 2000s, our incessant campaigning following a spate of honor killings of South Asian women resulted in a turning point when the then Home Office Minister, Mike O'Brien, famously broke with the multicultural consensus by announcing in Parliament that multicultural sensitivity was no excuse for official moral blindness. Signaling a dramatic shift in policy, he advocated a mature multicultural approach that was swiftly followed by a series of initiatives, laws, and policies aimed at protection and prevention from a range of culturally specific forms of harms, gender-based harms. For example, we saw the introduction of the Forced Marriage Civil Protection Act in 2007, which a decade earlier had been deemed a no-go area by the state. It was a potentially liberating moment for minority women. For a while, we attempted to nurture a more progressive form of multiculturalism, capable of reconciling diversity with universal rights, on the one hand, and allowing political space to ethnic minorities as citizens rather than as subjects of community leaderships on the other. But our efforts were undermined by the rise of the religious right in minority communities, which can be traced back to the controversial publication of the Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie in 1989, and the furor that followed. The affair became both the symbol and a catalyst for the growth of conservative religious identities in all communities, but particularly among South Asian men of Muslim backgrounds, who were heavily influenced by the resurgent and increasing transnational nature of Islamist politics in the countries of their parents' origins and elsewhere. Such radicalization that we have seen has since been mirrored in the Indian, Hindu, and Sikh diaspora populations in the UK, who have similarly been influenced by the resurgence of Hindu nationalism and Sikh religious fundamentalism in the Indian subcontinent. In response to the Rushdie affair, we set up Women Against Fundamentalism, which was made up of Black and white women from diverse ethnic and religious backgrounds, with the aim of challenging the impact of religious fundamentalisms in all religions, as we were seeing across the world, from Ireland to the US to Pakistan and elsewhere, Iran and elsewhere. It was an important move. By bringing together women of all backgrounds, it was an important move to counter the view that the only fundamentalists are Muslims. Our first act of defiance as Women Against Fundamentalism was to mount a counter-protest against the thousands of overwhelmingly young male Muslim demonstrators who marched in central London in support of the fatwa issued by Ayatollah Khomeini calling for Rushdie's death. This was also linked to their demand for an extension of the state's blasphemy laws to cover Islam, which at the time only covered Christianity and Judaism. At the time, the voices of support for Rushdie within the left were conspicuously absent, which allowed the media to reduce the issue to a battle between fundamentalists who claimed that their religious sensitivities had been offended, and liberal writers and artists who defended Rushdie on the grounds of free speech. Much of the anti-racist left remained largely silent, either because they feared fueling a racist backlash or because they had subscribed to the misguided view that Rushdie had in fact denigrated Muslim religious belief and identity. Women Against Fundamentalism was one of the few progressive voices that publicly supported Rushdie's right to write and to dissent. We recognized that what was at stake here was not just his artistic freedom, but we recognized that there were warning signs of religious fundamentalism underpinning the whole affair, and the consequences that this held, particularly for women's rights and freedoms, as well as for all progressive struggles everywhere. Standing in Parliament Square in London, there were 40 of us as we faced the thousands of angry young Muslim men, some of whom had once participated or even led secular anti-racist campaigns for self-defense in places like Bradford. We challenged them by drawing connections between Rushdie's right to dissent and the feminist tradition of dissenting. We called for the separation of religion and the state as a precondition for the realization of human rights for all. And that also meant actually asking for the abolition of the blasphemy laws altogether, which the Muslim fundamentalism wanted extended to cover the Muslim religion too. That march in London that day was led by opportunistic Muslim clerics and community leaders who formed part of wider global fundamentalist networks. They were transnational in nature. And the demonstrators who were there aimed their aggression at us, 40 women standing there, hurling sexist abuse as they tried to physically attack us and to tear down our banners. Presumably, they found the presence of women defying their authority and taking a political stance in defiance of their position deeply threatening. Ironically, though, at the same time, we also found ourselves confronting a small group of fascists, white fascists, who had also decided to use the opportunity to mount a racist anti-Muslim protest. However, being vastly outnumbered by the demonstrators, they turned against us as the easier target. So we found ourselves in the absurd position of fending off angry and violent Muslim men while at the same time confronting and challenging the Nazi salutes and fascist flag-waving white youth who hurled racist abuse at us. The moment has served as a visual representation of our political mantra about the absolute necessity of facing many political directions simultaneously to avoid creating a damaging hierarchy of struggle that privileges some forms of resistance against oppression over others. It was a seminal event in our history, but it was also a moment that seemed to mark the end of progressive Black politics. From there on, issues of equality and racism were reduced to questions of cultural diversity and representation based solely on religious affiliation as defined by religious fundamentalists. The post-Rushdie political landscape has since been characterized by the growing normalization of religious identity politics, the main beneficiaries of a concerted state policy that's moved away from multiculturalism, and certainly moved away from that mature multiculturalism phase that I talked about, and has finally moved towards multi-faithism. So we now can talk about our societies, characterize our societies as multi-faith societies. This is an even more regressive development that centers religion as the defining feature of minority identity and the primary lens through which minority needs are addressed. Fundamentalists and ultra-conservatives have gleefully seized on the spaces opened up by multi-faithism to mobilize around demands that protect and privilege religious identity while leaving issues of structural, racial, and socioeconomic inequality intact. A process of desecularization and de-democratization of civic spaces and culture has followed, greatly undermining the potential for developing coalitions and alliances. Coalitions and alliances based on shared political values to challenge a range of social issues, including the rise of anti-immigration racism, particularly in the post-industrial regions of the country. Some key themes to emerge from multi-faith politics are the following. First, the normalization of a heightened culture of blasphemy, hurt sentiment, and intolerance that has resulted in enforced silence and censorship. Fundamentalists of all hues have selectively marshaled the language of racism, anti-discrimination, even human rights, to gain political influence and power by which to impose greater restrictions on freedom of speech. This is one reason why I've opposed attempts to create an unofficial definition of Islamophobia that is promoted by the Muslim religious right. The term Islamophobia is riddled with ambiguity and presupposes that there is a homogeneous group of Muslims that consent to a singular version of Islam. In fact, as we know, there is plurality of different currents within Islam. Moreover, Islam is not a race or ethnicity. Rather, it represents a set of religious ideas, criticisms of which cannot be conflated with racism towards Muslims as a group. The term Islamophobia has actually frequently been deployed to silence all legitimate criticism of Islam, in particular by women and other nonconformists who need to assert their right to freedom from religion, particularly where it restricts their fundamental rights. I have argued that acts of discrimination and hatred against Muslims should be seen as anti-Muslim racism, and therefore fought as an aspect of racism in solidarity with those who share common experiences of racism. To privilege anti-Muslim racism and to treat it as somehow different to other forms of racism can only lead to hierarchies of victimhood and self-righteous indignation that fragments the anti-racist struggle. Worryingly but predictably, other minority religions have also followed suit in the wake of the calls for an official definition of Islamophobia. For example, the Hindu and Sikh right are also lobbying for the terms Hinduphobia or Sikhophobia to be officially recognized and adopted in law and social policy. They too are using the terms not to challenge racism, but to extract concessions from the state that give them greater political and social power. They too have made effective use of civic and parliamentary spaces to assert their definitions of Hinduism and British Hinduism and British Sikhism, and they too have created a culture of censorship and fear. Many examples abound. I can give you many. In 2006, for example, Hindu nationalists stopped an exhibition of paintings in London by the renowned Indian painter M.F. Hussain on the basis that his depiction of naked female deities offended so-called Hindu sensibilities. They argued that his work amounted to a public denigration of the British Hindu community, although what precisely they meant by Hindu sensibilities and the Hindu community, whose values they claim to represent, has never been established. Masquerading as representatives of a model, law-abiding Hindu community, they have also mounted a strident and a successful opposition to the introduction of anti-caste legislation in the UK that some of us had tried to introduce. Together with Sikh fundamentalists, they denounce calls for such legislation as Hinduphobic and Sikhophobic. Both groups have also rejected the label Asians, forget black. They rejected the label Asians for themselves because they want to distance themselves from Muslims, who they associate with barbarism, terrorism, and criminality. These new forms of religio-political identities have also generated unprecedented levels of communal tensions and violence in the UK. On 17th April 2022, in the city of Leicester, if you remember, I mentioned it earlier, a place that once saw Asian working class solidarity and secular anti-racist politics, now saw armed and unarmed men of Hindu and Muslim backgrounds marching through the streets, chanting incendiary anti-Muslim and anti-Hindu slogans, following several weeks of simmering tensions that had moved from the social media onto the streets. So the first time in the UK's history, we see Hindus and Muslims fighting each other. It was a calculated attempt to intimidate and incite hatred against the other. Sadly, it would appear that not much has been done to address the issue of communal violence in any meaningful way since 2022. And in the meantime, far-right politicians have cashed in on these divisions and captured the settled Indian Hindu and Sikh diaspora in their attempts to foment anti-Muslim and anti-migrant hatred, while paradoxically also asserting a white supremacist politics of identity and belonging. Another aspect of the multi-faith politics is that a new socially conservative contract based on hyper-masculinized and patriarchal sexual order has emerged, in which the subjugation of women and the policing of female sexuality has taken priority. For example, from 2013 onwards, we witnessed radicalized and masked Sikh youths protesting against interfaith marriages taking place in gurdwaras. Using intimidation and threats, they disrupted weddings as part of their political project to impose a puritanical and intolerant notion of Sikhism on the Sikh population. Clearly, such tactics were utilized not only to police the boundaries of religious affiliation, but also to claim ownership over women in particular. The vigorous use of so-called conversion narratives by both Sikh and the Hindu right is also another means by which control over female sexuality is maintained. Over the years, these forces have often called on the British state to stop the so-called forced conversions of Sikh and Hindu girls by Muslim men, without producing any cogent evidence that this has actually happened. Though through sensationalized meetings and online propaganda, they have spread disinformation about the so-called serious threat that Muslim men pose to Sikh and Hindu girls. Interestingly, in the context of the far-right violence last summer, some Sikh leaders publicly expressed outrage and protested against a racially aggravated incident of rape against a Sikh woman by white youths, although these same Sikh leaders have never spoken out in support of Sikh women raped by Sikh men. On the contrary, they have hounded Sikh women for raising such issues in public, as highlighted by the case of the playwright Gurpreet Bhatti, whose play Besti, which means dishonor, about a rape in a gurdwara was cancelled by the Birmingham Repertory Theatre in 2005 after Sikh fundamentalist protests, which turned against the play, and those protests actually turned violent and sent the woman into hiding. So religion is being used to impede women's fundamental freedoms and rights in other ways. Increasingly, religious leaders and authorities have made demands for strict dress codes for women and girls, gender segregation in education and other public spaces, the removal of sex and relationship education from the school curriculum, and the institutionalization of parallel religious systems of arbitration in family matters. For example, they call for so-called Sharia courts to be used to settle family disputes, even though these essentially private and discriminatory forms of dispute resolution fail to treat women as full persons before the law. There is considerable evidence to show how, in this context, women are subjected to degrading treatment, questions, and investigative procedures, and are prevented from leaving violent relationships, even if they're at risk of losing their lives. Now, it's interesting because in challenging some of these developments, we actually took inspiration from the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, who had successfully challenged the introduction of Sharia law in the Arbitration Act in Ontario. And they had argued that such a move would actually demean women's dignity and freedom and lead to unequal treatment and to their lack of access to the justice system. We made the same arguments and drew inspiration from their success. But we've also seen welfare services being replaced by those who are compliant with religious values. So we're seeing a desecularization process across all levels of society. And these developments are not just confined to Muslim communities. In 2024, in the UK, the first Sikh family court was set up. The stated aim of its creators is to complement the formal family justice system, which they say is increasingly overburdened, under-resourced, and faced with huge and lengthy delays that make access to justice difficult. This is, of course, true because years of austerity has done exactly that, and the cutbacks to legal aid has created a crisis. However, what we have here are conservative religious forces using the spaces opened up by the state policies on privatization to assert so-called Sikh family values and to undermine feminist gains in matters relating to issues such as marriage, divorce, inheritance, financial and children's arrangements, as well as domestic abuse and other forms of harm against women and children. And I fear that the Hindus are not far behind. So as a consequence, a substantial part of my work on violence against women in the last 3 decades has to use the campaigning and advocacy and legal tools to wrest control and power away from religious leaderships that deny women access to the formal legal system or to the state to assert their right to protection, choice, and autonomy. These are dangerous patriarchal processes that serve to enhance religious and social control and are ultimately even less amenable to accountability and gender justice than the formal justice system. Worryingly, the wider feminist movement has not been immune from these communalizing processes. Where once South Asian feminist organizations had names that conveyed their secular credentials, they're now replaced by those that organize around their religious identity. Names such as Southall Black Sisters or Birmingham Black Sisters that announced our Black radical politics, or those such as Saheli signifying friendship, or Asha meaning hope, or Roshni representing light, once dominated the landscape. Now organizations such as the Muslim Women's Network or Sikh Women's Aid have emerged. And some of this is performative for the purposes of justifying and securing funding. But regardless, the result is that these organizations reinforce communal divisions, which ultimately weakens the political project of solidarity that we had mapped out in the 70s and 80s. In other words, the use of religious frameworks to address key social issues only serves to delegitimize the radical vision and goals of feminism. Struggles for equality are replaced by calls for religious diversity and representation that are disconnected from class struggles. The third aspect of the multi-faith project is that the religious right has carried its agenda not only into state and civil society forums, but also left forums, where they are uncritically accepted as being the authentic voices of the communities they claim to represent. Part of the problem is that with consummate ease, they have used the language of anti-racism to promote an essentially intolerant, misogynistic, homophobic, and anti-democratic politics. We've seen a growing alignment of some on the left with the religious right, most notably in the Stop the War coalition, which has mobilized an anti-war and anti-imperialist agenda. But many on the left have not been able to distinguish between anti-Muslim racism and violations perpetrated by the state on the one hand, and on the other, those non-state forces that also violate and terrorize in pursuit of violent right-wing political agenda in the name of Islam or other religion. We saw this most clearly played out in the state's response, in the left's response to the state's war on terror project, and the failure of many on the left to challenge radicalization and its safeguarding consequences for women and vulnerable young people. So the left was only concerned with the state and its securitization and surveillance agenda, but not concerned with the ways in which fundamentalism was also radicalizing the youth and causing issues, particularly around safeguarding, and how to nor were they concerned with issues, concerned with the question of how to deal with such radicalization that was taking place amongst the youth, including amongst young women. Any attempt to talk about the consequences of radicalization was labeled Islamophobic. Left unchallenged, what this has done is imbue the left with an authoritarian ethic that suppresses dissenting voices with accusations of fueling racism and imperialism. Similar processes have been at work in relation to other minorities in the UK. For example, following the Black Lives Matter protests, much of anti-racist activism has also descended into the political blind alley of racial identity politics. Anti-racism has come to be reduced to a matter of white privilege, which ignores questions of class within white and black communities, or cultural appropriation, which fails to distinguish between cultural exploitation and cultural syncretism involving the fusion and coexistence of multiple identities. At the same time, the corporatization of black politics has resulted in an endless obsession with identity terminology. Minority, should we call ourselves minority, the minoritized, the global majority, over substantive equality outcomes. The focus has shifted to unconscious bias training, interpersonal relations, and the removal of barriers to upward social mobility, to the benefit and advantage of the elite classes from within minorities. Reflecting strong parallels with the discredited racial awareness training of the 1970s and 80s, what we see is a move away from grassroots political activism towards a politics leading to guilt, recrimination, and splintered unity in the face of structural and racial inequality and racism. The Black Lives Matter movement could have taken a different direction if the focus had been on creating solidarity. For instance, black people are disproportionately criminalized and harmed by the police, but so too are other minorities, poor white people, migrants, and even women who report domestic abuse, as revealed through the recent investigations into racism, sexism, and misogyny, and the lack of police accountability in police forces throughout the UK. So the preoccupation of left identity politics appears to be on what constitutes authentic representation rather than on the key drivers of structural inequality based on class, race, and sex, as highlighted so powerfully by the COVID-19 pandemic. We are no longer focused on wealth and health disparities, political corruption, demonizing and dehumanizing of migrants, and the accelerated dispossession of the working classes, black and white, who remain the majority in the UK. Another worrying aspect of racial identity politics that I've had to grapple with is the often simplistic and binary solutions that are posited to complex social issues. The rise of the anti-carceral movement, for example, and calls to defund the police has led some to question whether feminism has reached the limits of its engagement with the criminal justice system. These questions are based on the view that the feminist use of the criminal justice system serves not to empower or liberate, but to further marginalize and criminalize women, especially those from racial minorities who are disproportionately at risk of state-inflicted harm. And while it is accepted that there is an urgent need to look beyond the criminal justice system towards a more holistic approach to justice, especially that which addresses the economic and social conditions that also shape gendered violence, my view is that anti-carceral politics raise another set of dilemmas and contradictions that have yet to be properly acknowledged, let alone addressed. In particular, who or what fills the space vacated by the police and the criminal justice system, given the fact that non-state actors in particular religious and patriarchal forces, also wield castoral power in the family and community, a systemic power that manifests predominantly as intensified moral policing and coercive control, generating the very forms of gendered harms from which women need protection. So identity politics is not about concrete struggles that seek social transformations for an egalitarian end. Instead, it is about advancing the interests of identified groups that are driven by antagonism of each other, seeing the whole world entirely through the prism of identity has led us to a race to the bottom, as each group vies for the ultimate status of victimhood, a process that cuts off possibilities of alliances and solidarities. We can't come to solidarity if the first thing we do is point to our differences rather than our commonalities, even as we interrogate our different social locations. To conclude, it is clear that the left's descent into regressive identity politics has become self-defeating. Anyone who challenges its logic is viewed with great suspicion and labeled either right-wing or reactionary or subject to cancel culture and censorship. Identities are disconnected from material realities and closed off from critical interrogation. The journalist Keenan Malik has argued that the way the left thinks about campaigning against racism has been captured by identity politics. I would go further and say that the way that many on the left think about politics overall has been captured by identity politics. Much of left academic analysis has contributed to the crisis by allowing a one-dimensional and culturally relativist view of anti-racism, Western imperialism, and post-colonialism to dominate critical perspectives. The almost exclusive focus on state-perpetrated terror and the oppression of subaltern groups leaves little or no room to critique internal, non-state forces who also violate the rights of others, including women. Even amongst feminist academics, there has been a discernible anti-secular turn in which questions of women's religious agency are given prominence over questions of women's rights and secular autonomy. The failure to understand where the threats are coming from is creating the space for the far right and the religious right to fill the vacuum. This was driven home to me, particularly during the eruption of the far-right violence over the last couple of summers in the UK, when both the religious right and the far right made use of the opportunity to exploit women's concerns. On the one hand, the far right appropriated a discourse around protecting their women and girls from non-white men to stoke fears amongst ordinary white people. This manipulation has proven effective, as many claim they're not racist, but merely seeking to safeguard their daughters. It has also resulted in significant numbers of white women joining far-right demonstrations, often adopting slogans originally used by the feminist movement itself. And of course, the rhetoric appeals to many parents who view the family as the only site of security and certainty in an increasingly precarious world. However, it also serves to reinforce far-right ideas about traditional family structures and the strict gendered role that women must occupy within it. The instrumentalization of violence against women by the far right is, of course, not new to the history of racism and racial oppression. From slavery to contemporary forms of racism, the myth of the hypersexualized Black male, now also increasingly Muslim, migrant, and refugee, as sexual predators who pose a danger to white women, has always been a politically expedient core of white supremacist politics. There is an added sense of irony in the use of such dangerous racial narratives, flying in the face of the prevalence of gender-based abuse in all communities, and the fact that the evidence shows that many of the far-right rioters in 2024 had themselves been charged and convicted of various offenses relating to domestic abuse. On the other hand, the far-right riots were also weaponized by the religious leaderships and community patriarchs to exert greater control over their women and girls. South Asian women in particular reported that they were often confined to their homes, ostensibly for their own safety and protection from the riots on the streets, even though this confinement heightened their vulnerability to other forms of gender-based harms. To add to the complexity, community-based anti-racist protests were often dominated by young men who countered the far right using religious slogans. They shouted Allahu Akbar and generally mobilized around misogynist and bro-culture dynamics that made women feel safe and uncomfortable. Such framing of anti-racist resistance in religious terms reinforces a conservative and sectarian identity that has profound implications for women's rights to exercise choice and autonomy over their rights. It also, for me, is really striking because it shows how far we have moved away from the secular and inclusive anti-racist slogans of the 70s and 80s. Slogans such as, "We're here because you were there," "Here to stay," "Here to fight." Their replacement by religious slogans has only served to reinforce reactionary religious identity politics. Unsurprisingly, the exclusion and marginalization of Black and minority women has also continued in the aftermath of the riots as local authorities embark on plans for social cohesion and integration, but which involve engaging with male and community and religious leaders only, rather than women's organizations. And it's a situation that served to further consolidate and reinforce the role of male power brokers, even though few have any interest or history in genuine anti-racist work. So this experience shows that the task before us is immense. The longer we continue to deny all forces of authoritarianism, the harder it will be to distinguish the left from the right. If the left is to have a future, then we must urgently reclaim the secular histories of struggles waged by those who came before us. They talked in the language of universal rights and solidarity, and in doing so, they created the potential for building coalitions that were cross-cutting and outward-looking. I think this is especially significant if we understand that the identities we choose to adopt can either enhance or limit the possibility of forging progressive alliances, without which we cannot hope to defeat the forces of repression and authoritarianism. We can learn from the American civil rights movement. It didn't coalesce around the idea that identity politics held the key to liberation. Bayard Rustin, one of Martin Luther King's key political strategists, argued that the African American community was threatened by the appeal of identity politics. According to him, the rise of the Black Power movement repeated the political and moral errors of previous Black nationalists while alienating white allies needed by the African American community. He argued that the relevant question was not whether a politician is Black or white, but what forces he represents. What I am saying is that if a Black politician is elected because he is Black and is deemed to be entitled to a slice of the pie, he will behave in one way. If he is elected by a constituency pressing for social reform, he will, whether he is white or Black, behave in another way. June Jordan put it another way herself when she said something like, identity politics might have been important to get something started, but nowhere near enough to getting anything finished. We have become unstuck, not only because we don't know how to finish what we started, but because we have taken dangerously wrong turns. We need to return to where the people are at, to go back to grassroots community activism around issues of inequality and social justice, the loss of jobs, poverty, homelessness, health, access to legal aid, women's rights, migrant rights, climate justice, and so on. We desperately need to return to an ethical politics, which make it possible to hold on to more than one truth at the same time. We need to connect to the many acts of solidarity, protest, and resistance that are taking place across boundaries, often by the most powerless and the most adverse of circumstances. History has shown that community resistance based on need and the language of universal rights, compassion, resilience, and solidarity, rather than victimhood and identity, is likely to provide the most effective weapon against authoritarianism. It might also just serve as a more promising basis for building a new politics of liberation that gets us to the finishing line. Thank you. I've gone on from that.
Thank you. Thank you for those very powerful words. I know I'm not alone because I can see faces of people out there and how often people are nodding their heads, faces lighting up with sort of recognition of what she's saying, turning to people excitedly and saying, see, I've told you about this, that kind of stuff. So I'm obviously not the only one who's appreciating this. So maybe we should give her another round of applause.
Oh, thank you.
I'd really like to commend her on this very panoramic view of 40 years of anti-racist, feminist, and socialist politics, while at the same time also painting a very vivid picture of the kind of challenges we are facing, right? And to me, one of the images which I'm going to be remembering for a long time is of a small group of women confronting at the same time a group of Muslim fundamentalist men and a group of white fascists. That's an image that's going to be staying with me for a long time, and I'm sure for many of you as well. I don't know about you, but I'm left with two contradictory feelings. On the one hand, I just want to sort of sit with all the multitude of things that she's talked about and kind of cogitate about it. But at the same time, I'm also equally there's so many directions in which I'd like to take advantage of Pragna's presence here to ask her various kinds of questions. And I suspect many of you are going to be in the second category as well, even though I'm sure they'll all be thinking about this later on during the day and during the night. So I'm going to sort of go with the second instinct. And I see hands up there, but I'm just going to abuse my privilege of being the moderator by asking the first question, which is to say, there is a tension here about one thing that we hear today very often is the need for forming united fronts or popular fronts against fascism, right? And that involves coming to working with groups across differences of various kinds. How do you think we should be negotiating that tension? Right. And while she's sort of trying to answer that, I'm going to start looking around to see who has hands up, and I've seen one up there. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
How to form popular fronts against fascism? How do we negotiate that tension? I think we have to start by working within grassroots, community-based settings to try and reach out to people across the divides, whether it's your tenants association, whether it's in a school in the context of parents, whether it's other community-based organizations. I think the mistake we would make is to try and deal with this as individual groups, as separate groups. We have to come together to deal with the rise of fascism, but the fascism doesn't just surface through violence on the streets. It surfaces through the way we relate to each other, through the way in which, certain decisions are made, how actions, what's prioritized, what's not prioritized, the way in which community groups are divided or included in contexts of real life struggles. And I give you an example of something that I had to grapple with recently, which is, along with colleagues, we started a campaign called Suicide is Homicide. Now, this is in relation to the fact that we have, in the UK for the first time, domestic abuse-related suicides have surpassed domestic abuse-related homicides. So more women are killing themselves due to domestic abuse than are being killed by their abusive partners. Now, this campaign could focus on one particular group, for example, South Asian women. But we've actually consciously decided to broaden it out to include all families where they have experienced a suicide in this context in order to demand justice from the state. Now, in the course of supporting these families, some of the white families were also seduced by the far-right protests and were wanting to march, or at least were sharing social media posts about the far-right riots and the need to march in those demonstrations, which they saw as being about saving our women from migrant men, right? So there the question was, let's work with these families and talk to them and highlight how we have come together based on the common experiences, and how it is important to include all families, and if they go off and do this thing, what it means for our campaign for equality. That isn't explicitly about challenging the far right, but it is in the context of our concrete work, because we're trying to hold together this alliance of families from different and diverse backgrounds. And by doing this and focusing on their experiences and the commonalities of their experiences, we're also trying to show that there is nothing that they are experiencing which, lends itself to that kind of fascist propaganda. So I think, in a way, it's about how you work from where you're at in challenging these things as it arises in the course of your work, and how I think we do have to think carefully about whether we organize. Self-organization is important, as I outlined, in terms of how we started challenging racism and so on. But because it's not the end, we've got to figure out how we're going to forge these alliances as we're going along. We can't expect to start as a self-organized group and then get to the defeat of fascism at the other end without going through that process. And it's that process that matters in terms of how we are talking to each other, how we work with each other, how we challenge things as they arise in the context of working around the real needs and experiences of ordinary people. I don't know if that's at all. It's a very challenging question, but it's my instinct tells me that's what I would do.
I would trust your instinct.
Yeah.
First an observation, then a brief quotation, and then a question. The observation is around the generational demographics in this room, which is to say it's dominated by Gen Xers and older, and there are relatively few millennials and Gen Z in the room. And I think that ultimately it's millennials and Gen Z who need to hear your message, perhaps a fair bit more than those of us who are going to be more open to it. So that's the observation. The quotation is from Vivek Chibber, who a few months ago said, "Today's left is internal to neoliberalism. Still, it is in no position to challenge it because it cannot conceive of a world in which ordinary working people are the central political agent." Elsewhere, Chibber says, and I'm paraphrasing, "The problem with identitarian social justice politics is that class has been taken out of it." Is the answer here not really to recenter class, and in so doing, to start asking the questions and investigating the contemporary dynamics of class and power in our society? Isn't that really the answer?
Thank you very much. So yesterday we saw a remarkable occurrence in New York with the election of Zoran Mandani. When you look at that and you hear his speech, which I listened to in its entirety, imagining if you had been asked to advise him and his incoming administration on moving their program forward, what would you ask him to prioritize, given what he has achieved?
Well, to answer that last question first, I don't think he's done a bad job in terms of recentering class, to be honest. I think he has, I think it's really, really, really interesting that he has struck a chord with a very population that you would have also think would be seduced by the right? Around the same issues of poverty, marginalization, homelessness, all the real issues that need addressing, that lead people one way or the other and more to the right. So when we've talked about how the left has failed to deal with the question of class, it's because it's kind of been trapped into this tunnel, identity politics tunnel. And so what I would say to Zoran is exactly that: poverty, tackle poverty. Poverty is a really, if we look at neoliberal politics and what it's done in terms of impoverishing people, the destitution, the homelessness, the wrecking of the welfare state, the wrecking of the idea of the welfare state, I would say to him that we need to sing again and rebuild a welfare state. In the UK, back in the 70s, although there was a politics of despair there in terms of deindustrialization that took place, Thatcher had just come in, the beginnings of a neoliberal politics was beginning to take effect. We still had the welfare state to rely on. One of the single most important ideas that we've ever come up with as humanity, I think. And that need to have a welfare state and to build consensus around the need for a welfare state to deal with people's issues from the cradle to the grave, I think is what I would tell Zoran Mandani to focus on. And of course, he's only just the mayor of New York. I worry about what Trump's next move is going to be. I really worry about how much he's going to be undermined in terms of his anti-poverty politics. He's on the right track. I would say that he needs to rebuild the idea that humanity can only flourish if there is, amongst other things, a welfare state. And so that's, for me, really important. And that goes back also to the question of recentering class. I think it is important. I think we've forgotten class. We really have. In all this time, we've focused on identity politics. We look at issues of representation. We look at issues of cultural diversity. Diversity, inclusion, equality. I think the focus has always been on diversity and not equality. We've forgotten equality and what that really should mean. So for me, the question, about the politics of the left is that it's also been seduced by neoliberalism. When I talk about the fact that most of the work around diversity inclusion has been interpersonal, unconscious bias training, interpersonal kind of training around understanding white privilege and so on. What we're doing is not talking about structural forms of inequality. We're just talking about what are the barriers that might be removed for some people, largely creating a black middle class. That's what we've done. We've supported the elite in our own communities. And so for me, that neoliberal project has really penetrated and also impacted the way the left thinks about these things. So recentering class is central, but we've also got to do it in a way that also recognizes the other axes of power based on race, based on sex. And one of the most difficult things for us is not just how we theorize, but how we do a politics of race, class, and sex in terms of equality.
Thank you for what you shared, and I apologize, I'm a little nervous asking questions in public. So throughout your talk, one thing I kept on reflecting on is this common thread of people generally trying to seek a sense of community and belonging, but that is being transcribed and talked about through othering. Like, I belong because I'm not part of this group, or I belong because I'm not part of that group. So my question extends to, how do we help quote unquote different groups see each other as people versus, throughout the talk, like even I that has the privilege of like a very thorough education, as like looking up a lot of different words and terminology just to keep up with this. But it's at a human level, if I can see my neighbor as a person, it's so much more easier for me to empathize, be kind, to treat them in a more holistic sense. And I fear that we, as you've shared, moved so much farther towards what do you look like, and then presupposing your experience to who you are as a person. So my question, I guess, comes down to, how do we see each other as a fellow human being and to treat each other fairly as another person?
My feeling is that we have a politics that's very toxic at the moment. It's full of hatred, division, othering, and so on. I think we need to return to the language of empathy and compassion and resilience. I really feel that compassion in politics is sorely missing. And we really need to connect with people as human beings, and so return to the idea of humanity. I think that's the only way we can connect with each other and understand that we have a lot more in common than we have differences. So it is through that human connection, through the having a politics that actually prizes compassion, prizes humanity, prizes empathy, rather than what we have at the moment, whether it's Trumpian or Modi in India or wherever, which is very much based on playing on people's fears of the other. So I think returning to using the language of compassion, empathy, and resilience is really important. I think we often, we talk so much about everybody as victims and vulnerable victims. We don't talk about resilience. And it's really brought home to me how far we have moved from understanding what the real issues are in front of us. So if I give you a very simple example, but one that's really, I think, important, is the way in which our politics has also suffered from professionalization, NGOization of our work. So we've depoliticized ourselves. And one of the ways in which that has surfaced in the women's sector, working around violence against women and girls, is whereas once in the 80s, we as workers would go out and rescue women from wherever they were. And take them away from a violent and abusive situation. Now, if you ask a member of an organization to do that, they will say, I need to do my risk assessment. And to figure out the fact that actually I can't do it because of risk to me. Forget the risk to the woman. The staff are worried about the risk to them. And I think that's, in a small way, that's part of the problem of how we've moved so far away into the realms of subjectivity and our personal feelings and, you know, what we think about ourselves rather than how we meet the material needs of those in front of us who are clearly in a more powerless position and disenfranchised. So resilience is another important thing I want to inject into our politics, because we should be resilient. You know, a friend of mine who's a lecturer was saying that the students in his university were worried about confronting the fascists on the streets because of the trauma that they would experience. And he said, forget the trauma, you need to be where the fascists are at and fight back, you know? And that's the resilience you need to build. And it's that's also missing from the way in which we are conducting ourselves. So compassion, empathy, resilience are key to our politics of transformation.
Hi, thank you. Indeed, very powerful conversation. Got my mind thinking. So, got a couple of comments and a question. So coming from someone who's struggling at a level of identity politics with a desire of moving towards, a solidarity. So that's where I'm coming from. And my observation is that identity politics are born when the issues that a person or community is facing are not acknowledged, and the people are in denial. In India, Bahujan Samaj Party was formed because people felt that the left and the Congress weren't listening to their issues. So I appreciate your comment towards the end that it's a process of starting at one level and moving towards. I really, really appreciate that. And I want to understand a bit more about what that journey might look like. So my question specifically is some of the work that is happening among the diaspora on anti-caste discrimination. And are there any lessons or takeaways that you might want to share with us that you have seen in the UK or elsewhere, where the issue started out from identity politics, from caste, and then how the movement gained strength and became more resilient by working with other groups. And the reason I wanted to ask is that we're doing quite a bit of work here. And like I said, that I'm still stuck at the personal and the identity politics level, but I do have a desire of moving towards. If there are some lessons that we can take away, we'd like to build those into our strategy. So if you could share those, that would be great. Thank you.
I just had a really specific question about the example you shared, suicide as homicide, and the group of families that wanted to join the far-right demonstrations, and you said you had conversations with them. I was curious about your approach to those conversations, and were they successful? And then the second part to my question is, I think here in Vancouver, when you're trying to build a broad-based coalition, you run very quickly into people saying, if you don't agree with everything, every part of our ideology, then we can't work with you. You're fascist or whatever. In that case, how would you go about building a broad-based coalition?
Thank you very much. As one of the few Gen Z people here, thank you. I would like to pose a question regarding what you said about empathy and related to social media, because social media is a place where people can say anything they want behind from a screen with a black profile picture and they face no consequences. And with on social media, TikTok, Instagram, if somebody shares somebody getting beaten up on the road just because of their caste or religion, or some women, talking about her sexual assault experience, people in the comments drag it down to oh, whatever, you're a Muslim, you deserve this, you're a woman, you deserve this. They always bring it down to that, and they face no consequences. So like, how do we navigate social media with this, where everything is said, no consequence, you can say whatever, with empathy, and with the new generation where they just say whatever and they're moving to like this far right, like extremism? How do we navigate social media with empathy? That's it. Thank you.
So, social media has really amplified that kind of the toxic nature of the politics, and I really worry about social media because what we've got is lynch mob politics, right? Where if anyone says something, forget far right or racist, but even if you say something that others don't agree with, you are shut down, you are shouted down. So I think there is a serious problem with the way in which we relate to each other, the way in which we talk to each other, and the way in which we are so sure of our own perspective that we don't want to talk through the differences. And so I guess the question is whether social media is the place to actually talk through differences, whether that is just so soundbite politics that I'm not sure that that's a place for genuine discussions, and certainly not the kind of discussions about navigating someone away from the far right, for example, or anti-Muslim hatred, So I think that it's a challenge. I don't know the answer to how we deal with social media. We need social media, but it's become a liability in terms of our politics, and it's kind of reinforcing and accelerating a process of fear, censorship, silencing, and so on. So most people who might want to say something different or question would dare not say it. And if they do, there is a lynch mob attitude that stops anyone from saying anything. So I think, I don't know what we do with that, except that we don't use social media, basically, for those kinds of genuine, solidarity building can't be built over social media. Clearly it can't. It's through work. It's through doing things together that you talk through those differences that arise. As you're talking through, how do we tackle this? What is the tactic? Where are the strategies? Whose voices do we want to be heard? It's that doing the politics that gives rise to discussions around differences and then navigating your way through those differences to come to compromise positions, or where one particular idea is prioritized over others. But that comes through genuine collaboration and discussion and so on. The question about those families and how we talk to them. What was really great about that was there were white working class families who were opposed to what was going on. They became the voice. They were the ones who said to the others, you cannot be going on those protests and stay in this campaign. So it was really useful. And what we did was actually support those voices. So those were white working class women who had themselves seen what was being done on social media about how the other families were. They didn't go in the end, but they were tempted. And she dealt with them through her conversations with them. But behind the scenes, we supported her. We talked to her and reinforced her view that it was wrong, and gave her, and as she talked through with us, she got the strength and the courage to then challenge the others, the other white working class families, not many, but some who were going in a different direction. And that, I think, is really important. But you know what? They also wanted to stay with us because they saw that we were delivering. That we were delivering on the campaign, that we were working, and that it made a difference. I think, with a lot of this, there's no magic bullet. It's about actually getting down, getting your hands dirty, and getting on with the task of what needs to be done. And people are so desperate for support, for help, that actually when they see that you're doing something they are less likely to go away and be seduced by other things, and more likely to say, actually, you know what, Pragna, you're working for us. We can see the difference it's making. We want to stay here. And that means then that when I put out my publicity about, we had an event in Parliament around the launch of the campaign, in my blurb, I also put at the end, we want to respect and ensure that we support all families, irrespective of background, who are facing these issues. Now, that was a quiet way for me to ensure that those families stayed on track with us. You know, it was just one line, but it makes a difference in terms of trying to stay together. So that was some of the ways in which we tried to work to hold together a campaign across different groups. The anti-caste question of how we built solidarity, it started off with the Dalit groups in the UK who raised this. This was their issue. They were the ones who wanted to see anti-caste legislation as part of race equality legislation in the UK. But we immediately recognized that this was an issue about structural inequality, about one of the worst forms of gender apartheid, racial apartheid. You know, it is a form of racial apartheid. The whole ideology is based on that. So for us, those of us who are anti-racist could also see the connections between what they were doing and what we needed to do was support them. So they led the campaign, but groups like us, so we're feminist, we wanted to support that because we think that, you know, opposing caste discrimination and caste inequality is essential for our liberation. We can't achieve, you know, it's that cliche that you can't achieve a liberation based on someone else's oppression. So for us, it's important to recognize that. And there are other anti-racist groups who also supported that. Actually, the people who opposed us were the Sikh and the Hindu fundamentalists. And they argued that, you know, there's no such thing as caste discrimination. We don't have that in the UK. We might have that in India, but this is the UK. We're British. We don't have it. You know, that was their argument, essentially, even though we presented evidence to show otherwise. But it was led by those Dalit groups. And it was important that they led it because it was how they were determining the issue. And it was really important for the rest of us to galvanize support to support them. And so, you know, whether it's working within the community to get that support from ordinary people, which is very difficult, I have to say. You know, and there were many, the state wasn't very interested either. And in the end, we lost that. And we lost it because the British state is desperate post-Brexit to do trade deals with India. So it's not going to do anything that jeopardizes that. And therefore, although they had made a promise to introduce anti-caste discrimination legislation, caste discrimination legislation in the Race Equality Act, they withdrew from that very fast. But there was a strong alliance of feminists, anti-racist groups, and Dalit organizations that came together to challenge, to challenge the caste discrimination, and in the process also to highlight the Hindutva and the Sikh fundamentalist politics and expose what was going on. Yeah.
I think we can keep going on, but we are at time at this point. And there is some food outside, so there's also more occasions for all of us to continue this discussion. So once again, I'd like to thank Pragna for a very inspiring... Thank you all for coming, and please help yourself to some food here.